Welcome to today's webinar, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The Clearinghouse provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association, as well as 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. You can also search for event number 9256079. I would like to acknowledge our webinar partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So today our speaker is M. Nolan Gray. Nolan Gray is the research director for California YIMBY and is an expert in urban land use regulation. He is completing a PhD in urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. Gray previously worked as a planner in New York City, where he worked on the front lines of zoning. Nolan is a widely published author with work appearing in publications such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg City Lab, and The Guardian. He lives in Los Angeles and is originally from Lexington, Kentucky. Following his presentation, our presenter will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located on the control panel on the right side of your screen. And as usual, we're going to start with a few polls to get started today. If you're unable to respond to the poll, you may need to exit full screen mode. First question is the one we always ask, which is just asking where everybody lives and works. And you can see the options on your screen there, including one from outside the US. And we'll give everybody about a minute or so to respond and then share the results. We actually have 3 poll questions today before we get started with Nolan. So thank you for being with us today. As I always say, it's interesting to see where the geographic distribution is based on the topics. And today looks very well represented throughout the US. Give you a couple more seconds, and thanks for responding to these. It's good information for everybody. So today's audience, 32% says they're in the Midwest or Northeast, or Mid-Atlantic or Northeast, 23% in the South, 19% in the West and Midwest, and 7% are reporting to be outside the US today. Our next question will pop up here momentarily. How familiar are you with zoning? So you have 4 options here. I'm an expert, I know the basics, I'm aware of it, and I know nothing about it. And again, we'll give everybody a few seconds to respond here, and thank you for participating. Monitoring the responses already. Not surprisingly, I would say most of the folks in our audience are familiar in some way. So we'll give you a few more seconds to respond and close it out. So, okay, most everybody does know something. 46% know the basics, 45% are experts, 8% are aware, and only 1% know nothing about zoning. So that's good to see. One last poll here. And that is zoning reform underway in your municipality and or state? So you again have 5 options here. You can select one. Yes, we've passed reforms. No, but reforms have been introduced. No, but there's talk about reform. No, not at all, and I don't know. And thank you for participating in this one. A couple more seconds here for folks to respond. And for this one, 34% says yes, we've passed reforms. 24% says no, but there's talk. 17% no, but reforms have been introduced. 10% no, not at all, and only 15% say I don't know. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nolan Gray. Welcome, Nolan.
Great, thanks so much for having me. Let me get this all pulled up here. So thank you to the Maryland Department of Planning. It's great to be chatting with you all. I've lived on and off in metropolitan DC for the past 10 years. So I've grown to really love Maryland and spent a lot of time there. And I know you all are dealing with some incredible planning challenges. Also some of the most exciting and innovative work that I've seen in North America is happening in the Mid-Atlantic. So it's exciting to be speaking with you all. So based on the poll results, it seems like 90% of the folks tuning in here know quite a lot about zoning. So that's fantastic. Normally I start these talks, I give a pretty long preface, long, exciting, exhilarating preference on what zoning is, but I'll move quickly through that. And it seems like 3/4 of the folks tuning in here today are engaging with some form of zoning reform, either at the state or local level. So you know that's partly one of the main reasons why I wanted to write the book when I did. So it strikes me that 2 things are really going on right now. The first is that a lot of people who hadn't previously thought about zoning are thinking about zoning for the first time. I always tell the joke, you know, before maybe 2 or 3 years ago, zoning was the type of thing where if you wanted to politely exit a conversation, you could just bring up zoning and the other person would have to use the bathroom or go refill their drink. Now we're in a unique moment where a lot of lay people have heard about zoning, but non-planning practitioners have heard about zoning. They want to learn more. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do with the book is provide a little bit of that context that maybe folks here on the call understand, but when we're talking with members of the public, they might not have a clear sense of what zoning is, where it comes from, how it works, how it doesn't work. The second thing is to chart, I think, a path forward. You know, I think so as the poll indicated, most folks here are engaged in some type of zoning reform. You know, of course, in a certain sense, zoning has always been reforming itself. It's always been changing since it was adopted. But it does seem right now there's an incredible national conversation happening. You know, you can't open the opinion pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post or any major newspapers without seeing editorials about zoning. In 2020, the presidential candidates had opinions on zoning. Of course, the quality of the conversation wasn't necessarily where some of us might like it to be, but folks are talking about zoning and they're talking about how to change it. And to my mind, there's a really fundamental conversation happening, lurking under the surface about the way we plan our cities and the way we conduct land use planning. So that's what I try to tackle in the book. In this talk, I'm going to give a broad overview of the book, and if any of this interests you, I invite you all to go check it out. But I'll be going over the broad points here and try to leave as much conversation as possible or as much time as possible for conversation at the end of the talk. So part one of the book deals with what zoning is and where zoning comes from. So of course, with zoning, there are two big components here. There's the zoning ordinance, which has the rules that apply to all of the different zoning districts. And then there's the zoning map, which applies those rules to every single parcel in a given city. The color scheme here is pretty typical for mainly talking to the 10% of folks who are still learning a lot about zoning. The color scheme here is broadly indicative of how these work across the country, red being commercial, yellow being residential, with darker shades being more intensive residential or commercial, and then generally purple being an industrial use, and blue being some type of institutional or special district. So from these two documents, we essentially get the materials that dictate what you can do on every single parcel in most of urban America. And so I'm defining zoning in a way, I think one of the challenges I face when I talk to people about zoning is they'll say something like, I'll propose that we consider zoning reform, and folks will say something like, oh, well, you need building codes to make sure that buildings are safe, right? To which I say, yes, that is not zoning. That is very different from zoning. Or you'll have folks say, well, we need to preserve our historic buildings. To which I say, yes, that's also very important. Zoning is really two specific things. The first, as I illustrate here, is use segregation. So at the heart of the way we do land use planning in the US today is this notion that different types of land uses should be in different parts of the city. They should be kept separate from each other. There should be discrete areas for business and shopping. There should be discrete areas for residential. There should be discrete areas for industry. And now historically, of course, even before the rise of zoning, it was very common for cities to say really offensive industrial uses have to go in a particular part of the city. That was very common. But what's new with zoning is this notion that all commercial will be kept separate from residential. Of course, historically, and many great examples of this in Maryland, uses intermingled. You would have maybe a corner grocery or a corner doctor's office in a residential neighborhood. But then even within subcategories, so in a pre-zoning neighborhood, you might have apartments next to single-family homes, next to townhouses. What zoning has done is said we're going to separate all of these uses. And I love the illustration here on the right. This is from a planning document from the 1950s, illustrating really the social project of zoning. I think it's also part of the reason why I call the book Arbitrary Lines is that I think there's a technocratic gloss that's put on zoning, but actually lurking underneath that is a very social project, a notion of what a good city and a good family and a good home looks like. And of course, here you have the nuclear family with the car parked in the back and a nice little Cape Cod on a 7,000 square foot lot. And then the only things that are supposed to be near them are farming, schools, and churches. So, there's a clear social vision here. The second thing that zoning is doing is restricting density, placing rules on density. So this, of course, this comes up in things that I think most people are familiar with, things like height limits, things like setbacks, which are distance from the property line. But key to zoning also is just flat limits on the amount of floor area or the number of units that you can build in any given area. Now on the right here, you have floor area ratio, which is essentially the wonkiest possible way that we could have put limits on the amount of floor area you can build on a lot. But generally speaking, it controls how much you can build on any given lot. And something I try to do in the book, and something I try to talk about in conversation with folks who don't think about this all day, they live normal, happy lives, is illustrating certain types of land uses that in many cases zoning makes illegal today, rather than try to explain FAR or setbacks. So the broader narrative here, of course, is that zoning, as I suggested earlier, is not synonymous with planning. Humans have been planning basically since we started to settle down. In the Western tradition, of course, we see early city planning beginning with the ancient Greeks who were establishing colonies around the Mediterranean. The first thing they would do, of course, is identify an agora, a big giant public space in the middle of town, and then plan out a street grid from there. And historically, of course, we did quite a lot of that. Here's another great example from the Mid-Atlantic nearby, the plan for Philadelphia. You take a flat area of land, you grid it out, you put parks at regular intervals, you have a big civic plaza in the middle. Humans have been doing that since basically the beginning of civilization. And that's very different from the zoning system that starts to emerge in 1916. In the 1920s, this is on the tail, 19-teens, 1920s, on the tail end of the progressive era. Of course, you get the emergence of zoning, which is a system that's taking every single parcel in the city and saying we're going to identify the allowed uses and the allowed densities and the allowed scale on every single parcel in the city. And then, of course, this scales up over the course of the 20th century. In the book, I highlight 2 early zoning codes to illustrate the origins of zoning. On the right, of course, here we have an illustration from New York City's 1916 zoning ordinance, which of course is quite famous as the first zoning ordinance. But a few other cities actually adopted zoning ordinances in 1916, and to the extent that it foreshadows the zoning codes that were to come, I actually think Berkeley is more interesting as a zoning origin story. Now, in both cases, I tell these stories to quibble with, I think, some of the established wisdom about what zoning was and what zoning was trying to do. I think there's a very anodyne origin story that's told about zoning that says, well, we had to keep oil refineries out of single-family neighborhoods, or we had to deal with this uncontrolled growth, and we had to have some plan to coordinate it with infrastructure. As I highlight, I think based on a very robust literature in the case of New York City and Berkeley, at a minimum, the story is much more complicated than that. So, of course, in New York City, the main group that was pushing for zoning was the Fifth Avenue Association, which, yes, was concerned about industry encroaching on their very posh shopping district, but not for any nuisance or externality use that we might understand in the modern sense, but because they were concerned about the poor factory girls coming out on their lunch breaks or after work and scaring off their clientele. Or in Berkeley, of course, one of the main contributions of the Berkeley Code is the first single-family zoning district, which says the only thing we're going to allow in most of our residential areas is a detached single-family home. And even to the extent that concerns about industry come up in the Berkeley zoning code, they're in many cases coded based on class or racial prejudices. So in promotional materials from the early Berkeley code at the time, yes, they'll talk about industrial uses, but the industrial use will be a laundry that's run by Chinese Americans. And of course, there's an intense amount of discrimination against that population at the time in California. And it was a similar story happening all across the country. Of course, there was a wave of adoptions of zoning codes in the immediate aftermath of Buchanan v. Worley, in which the Supreme Court, in a rare moment of clarity on racial issues, said we're not going to allow explicitly racial zoning. What you see in the immediate aftermath of that is widespread adoption of Euclidean zoning codes that do broadly the same type of segregationist policy, but through the lens of class. Another sort of element of the zoning origin story that I quibble with a little bit in the book is the notion of zoning as this bottom-up, emergent, popular movement. As I point out in the book, zoning was actually, the bones of modern Euclidean zoning were heavily drafted, promoted, subsidized, and then eventually mandated by the federal government. So, of course, most planners will be familiar with the Standard Zoning Enabling Act. This is essentially where the federal government under Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover drafted a standard zoning enabling act, which states would adopt to allow local governments to adopt zoning codes. Drafted that, mailed it out to every state. Very quickly after, the Supreme Court gives its seal of approval in Euclid v. Ambler, a case in which Justice Sutherland somewhat infamously refers to apartments and presumably the people who live in them as mere pests. And then over the course of the 20th century, as the federal government plays a larger and larger role in funding local government or funding planning efforts, the zoning becomes in many cases subsidized, mandated, a condition for funds. I was talking to a planning colleague just recently in Appalachia, and to be eligible for certain FEMA funding, they had to show that they had adopted a comprehensive plan and a zoning ordinance. And this was a very small community, and they had no need to engage in any type of use segregation or density rules, but that was a condition for federal funding. So of course, that is, zoning rapidly spreads over the course of the 20th century, both because of certain special interest groups at the local level and then a large federal push. And this is relevant, I think, today as we're having conversations about what is the role of the federal government in rolling back some of these rules. And I would suggest, as I argue in part 3 of the book, that the federal government actually played a large role in promoting a lot of these rules. And so I think they have some role to play in rolling them back. Again, just to reiterate a point that I'm at pains to stress here, the land use planning framework that we have in the US includes many different rules and many different mechanisms. So zoning, I think, is even a small piece of even just land use planning. So of course we have rules like historic preservation to deal with historic properties. We have rules like subdivision regulations to deal with the subdivision of land and the creation of new neighborhoods. These policies have their own triumphs and failures, but they're really not the focus of this book. And I don't think that those are issues that I think are worthy of serious critical reevaluation in the years to come. But in this book, I'm really focusing on zoning as this transparently dysfunctional policy. So the trouble with a broken land use planning system. I'm out here in Los Angeles. This is Westwood. This is the somewhat infamous Condo Canyon, showing some of the strange results that you get from zoning. So we have towers right next to single family homes. So the first, I think, way that zoning has gone awry is, I think it's really at the root of the housing affordability crisis that a lot of cities are dealing with. Before the pandemic, I work here in California, where we're passing great legislation at the state level to reform zoning rules and make it easier to build more affordable, equitable, and sustainable cities. But before that, I would spend a lot of time talking to policymakers at the state and local level all across the country. And I almost had to convince them that this was an issue worthy of thinking of. Of course, over the last 2 years where home prices have just exploded, these issues require no justification. But I argue that zoning increases housing costs in 3 ways. And I pull on the really, really robust urban economics and real estate literature here. The first is zoning simply just doesn't allow a lot of housing to be built. So the most obvious mechanism for this is policies like single family zoning. So this is, of course, Los Angeles, where 75% of areas that have been deemed appropriate for residential, it's illegal to build anything other than a detached single family home. So we've identified areas, this is an appropriate place for people to live, but no, we will not allow duplexes, we will not allow townhouses, we will not allow multifamily. So in this sense, zoning just blocks a lot of housing from getting built, and it's very, very hard. And of course, there's discretionary mechanisms, but those are very expensive, and many projects just can't hack it. The second mechanism zoning makes housing more expensive is requiring the housing that is built to be quite a bit more expensive than consumers might have otherwise preferred. So here, of course, in the top right, I highlight the effect of parking requirements. This is a great graphic by some friends at the Parking Reform Network. And it's essentially showing what a 2 parking space per 2-bedroom multifamily unit means, and essentially means almost doubling the amount of area that they will have to consume. If this is a surface lot, of course, that means more land, which means more sprawl. If this is structured, or certainly if it involves any excavation work, this could get quite expensive, as much as $80,000 added per unit. If this is let's say this is a $200,000 condo, exactly the type of starter homes that many cities need today, those parking requirements have almost increased the cost of that condo by 50%. So there are a whole bunch of different rules like this in zoning, from minimum unit sizes to minimum lot sizes. I'll talk about some of them over the course of the talk, and there's a lot of reform energy focused on these. The second is just delaying additional housing or adding additional process that doesn't necessarily achieve public objectives. So the bottom right here is the process that I worked with in New York City, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, ULURP. One of our many fine qualities as planners is that we love acronyms. But so this was actually probably a fairly one of the better ways to deal with this problem. Hard 6 months to get through the process, but that's still 6 months added to the process. In many cases too, there's extensive pre-application work that needs to be done. Projects get thrown into a discretionary permitting universe where even if we know with relative certainty there's no environmental impact to the project, it's still going to have to do an environmental review. It's still going to have to undergo public hearings, even if it's the type of project that we as a community have said this is appropriate. And this, of course, adds time and cost and delay to the process. It squeezes out small developers who don't have the capacity to deal with that type of process, and it ultimately leaves our cities more unaffordable. I'd say the second, this is especially an argument that I would develop when many people weren't thinking about housing affordability, was the broader economic costs of some of these rules. So, of course, zoning rules in many cases make it hardest to build additional housing or additional office or commercial space in the areas of the country where we have the most productive, the most thriving economies, right? So historically, Americans would move from poorer, less productive cities, states, regions to richer, more productive cities, states, regions. Right? So famous examples of this is the great migration of African Americans out of the South into the industrial Midwest, or in my own family history, the movement of folks out of Appalachia into the Northeast and the industrial Midwest. Americans would move to opportunity. Now Americans do the opposite because it just becomes so unaffordable to live in some of our most thriving, exceptional cities. So of course now here in Los Angeles, people move from Los Angeles out to Nevada, Arizona. No problem with those places, and it's perfectly fine if a family wants to do that. But if they're being forced to because they simply can't afford a home in the place where they're originally from, of course that's a failure of policy. And this has cost all of us. So there's great economics literature on this suggesting that this lowered overall GDP by 36% from 1964 to 2009. Another estimate suggests that if our 3 most productive cities were to liberalize, real GDP per capita would rise by 8%. Cities are these engines of productivity, these engines of growth. And to the extent that zoning makes it, essentially tries to turn every single city into a large suburb, it doesn't allow us to tap into the wealth and the creativity that reinvents the economy. The third big piece here, and I think this is certainly top of mind when I was writing the book in 2020, I was living in DC, and the Black Lives Matter protests were underway, is the relationship between zoning and segregation. So as I suggested earlier, contemporary zoning policies are a reaction in many cases to the federal government rendering explicit racial zoning unconstitutional. But zoning pursues, contemporary zoning pursues virtually the same objectives, but through the lens of class. By the ability to say what type of housing can be built where, you essentially have the ability to say what type of person can live where. And this shows up in the literature. So early adopters of zoning, cities that adopted zoning 1900 to 1940 ended up 50% more segregated than cities that were late adopters. So cities that were leaning into some of these zoning mechanisms that said, we're not going to allow apartments here, but we're going to allow them there, ended up much more segregated. And the broader trends on segregation are kind of interesting. Within cities, any given neighborhood has become more integrated, but among cities within a metropolitan area, different cities have become more segregated. So white cities have become more white, black cities have become more black, et cetera. And of course, this tracks very closely onto the level at which we set land use policy. So suburbs that don't want to allow anyone below a certain income or who looks a certain way essentially have that power to. They have almost unlimited power to ban certain types of inherently affordable housing typologies that might help us build more integrated neighborhoods where people, regardless of their background, can pursue opportunity. Of course, the graphic here on the left is from the campaign for explicitly racial zoning in St. Louis. Then the image on the right was a photo I took in Austin of a protest against a zoning code rewrite that would liberalize the Austin zone. Of course, Austin, Texas is under enormous growth pressure, and there's incredible demand for housing. And if they don't build more housing, prices are going to keep going up. Code Next was an effort to try to liberalize this zoning code that had written before, when Austin was still a sleepy little college town. And here's a person opposing it, and then right next to it, there's this, all are welcome here sign. And I think a lot of people don't really understand sort of what the policies that they support are actually doing in practice, or if they understand they're not seriously reckoning with how this might violate some of their other principled commitments. It's very cheap to say all are welcome here, and then to oppose any multifamily or any affordable housing that's going to be built within a half mile of you. Zoning is, of course, the mechanism that we use to keep that status quo entrenched. The fourth big way that I think zoning has kind of gone wrong here is the sustainability piece of it. So, of course, certainly here in California, we're thinking a lot about climate change. Just lived through a September where we were regularly in the 90s in an apartment in a place in Los Angeles where many people don't have air conditioning because it was just historically temperate. So many people are thinking about this. I'd say the first big environmental cost with zoning is just the space that's wasted, right? So, of course, the rule that I focus on here in the book is minimum lot sizes. So this is even above and beyond just saying we're only going to allow detached single-family homes. In many parts of the country, we say, well, those lots have to be quite large. Those lots have to be 10,000 square feet. Those lots have to be 5,000 square feet. Those lots have to be a half acre. Of course, that just consumes additional space and forces cities essentially to sprawl out by not allowing for not only just multifamily, but also single family development on smaller lots. We've essentially forced cities into a sprawling development pattern. Just about the only form of development that zoning isn't antagonistic to is a new detached single family subdivision on the periphery. You want to build an apartment on the side of a former strip mall, or you want to subdivide an existing single family home into a duplex, good luck, lawyer up, right? Second mechanism here, I think, relationship between zoning and the environment is the assumption of universal car dependence, right? So, of course, many zoning codes have minimum parking requirements, which I talked about earlier, but also this idea that uses should be segregated essentially assumes that you are going to drive to all of your daily needs. Everything is going to be a drive everywhere. You are not going to walk or ride a bike to any of your daily needs, to your job, to local recreation. And this is the picture on the right here is from DC, fairly common in Maryland as well. It's an old corner shop in a predominantly residential neighborhood that historic before zoning had been one of these little might have been a corner shop that served local residents, but under zoning it cannot be anything other than residential. And so of course you have this very unusual looking building that is very clearly a storefront that legally can no longer be a storefront. So we've essentially stamped out these historical patterns of urban infill and urban diversification that actually made our neighborhoods more resilient, more healthy, more sustainable, more vibrant, and forced them into what I argue is the straitjacket where every part of all uses are going to be at separate parts of the city and you're going to drive between them. Okay, so everyone's now thoroughly depressed, although planners to a certain extent are permanently cynical. But let's see the light at the end of the tunnel here. So I actually think this is a really exciting issue to be working on, and an issue that we really need planners to be leading on. And I increasingly see planners leading on it, and I'm constantly in awe of some of the reform efforts that I'm hearing about. But so the first, reforming zoning at the local level, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here. So at the local level, of course, local governments have almost unfettered authority on how they administer zoning. Of course, historically, that's been used toward unsavory ends for the most part, but the flip side of that is that we can use that to unilaterally get rid of some of the rules that we just know are bad and destructive. So many cities, for example, are eliminating minimum parking requirements, if not within the entire city, maybe within proximity to transit, where they're most likely to be binding, or in certain walkable neighborhoods where they're most likely to be binding. I highlight Fayetteville, Arkansas, which is a great example. I often find when I talk to folks, I'll provide an example. If I provide an example from New York or Los Angeles, to the extent that any zoning reform is happening in those cities, they'll say, well, our city's just so different. Like we have nothing to learn from them. One of the great things about the current moment that we're in is that there are comps for almost every city, suburb, town that are engaging in zoning reform. When I talk to folks in my hometown of Lexington, I highlight Fayetteville, another mid-sized college town, and say, hey, they've eliminated minimum parking requirements for commercial development. They're allowing for all those vacant strip malls to actually develop into something that our community wants. So local reform, local text amendments, local rezonings is something that we can do in the near term. Second is I think there's a large role to play for the state government. Now, of course, that's less of a controversial claim in a place like Maryland, where you all have a really robust statewide planning framework. I'm sure everyone on the call is acutely aware of the deficiencies of that framework. But in many places, the state government really plays almost no role in how local governments administer zoning. I would argue, that's not the appropriate relationship to have. Zoning is a delegated power. Housing markets are metropolitan. We do transportation planning at the metropolitan level. I think there's some role for land use planning to also figure into a larger level of government. So here in California, for example, we're doing a lot of reform at the state level. And one of the big, most successful reforms is statewide accessory dwelling unit legislation. So in 2016, we legalized accessory dwelling units statewide, set clear standards, shot clock rules, regulating things like impact fees that can be charged. And with 5 years of permitting data, we can say that reform allowed 60,000 new units to get built in California. Just putting up guardrails and saying, we're going to put up some guardrails on how you can administer single family zoning, for example. And then of course, recently we adopted SB 9, which allows duplexes statewide in all residential districts. So I think that's the appropriate kind of reform that state governments can be undertaking. I think at the federal level, as I teased earlier, I think the federal government also has an important role to play in this, to the extent that the federal government backed and promoted a lot of these early zoning codes. So, I think it's perfectly appropriate for the federal government to say, for example, if you want to be eligible for community development block grants, or if you want to be eligible for surface transportation grants, or if you want to be eligible for transportation funding, we want to see a local plan to roll back some of these exclusionary segregationist rules, or we want to see a plan to build new housing near this major transit investment that we're about to make. There's been a lot of conversation in DC about this, and of course, DC moves a little bit slower than the states and the local government these days, but I think there is an important role for the federal government to play. I think there are also lessons, last on this, on reforming zoning piece, I think there are lessons to be learned from abroad. So I highlight, of course, in the book, Japan. Japan is interesting both procedurally and substantively. So procedurally, in Japan, there are 12 or 14 zoning districts. I always get these mixed up. That are defined at the national level. These are the zoning districts that local governments can map. Local governments can map them, but essentially the zoning text is written at the national level. The zoning districts and the standards for those districts is written at the national level, and local governments map them. So that's, I think, a procedural difference that's actually really valuable. Here in the US, of course, every single local government writes their own zoning code de novo, and sometimes they just copy each other's work. In some cases, they write their own elaborate codes that are very difficult for outsiders to interpret. I think some consistency is what makes the Japanese system quite a bit more effective. But also on the substance piece, even the most restrictive zoning district in Japan, for example, it allows for low-rise multifamily. It allows for that type of small neighborhood-focused commercial development to be built without much fuss, without a big public hearing, without a rezoning. And then, of course, the other districts are quite liberal as well. There are certain rules about guardrails about massing and really offensive heavy industry. But for the most part, Japan, like France, another country with a highly functional land use planning system, allows for a high degree of use mixture and high degree of density where it's most appropriate. But as I argue in the book, I'm a little bit cautious about purely pursuing zoning reform in itself. I think in the near term, zoning reform makes a lot of sense, and of course, that's what we're focused on at California YIMBY, and we're making huge gains. And a lot of the planners who I talk to are focused on reforms. What I would like to have a bigger picture conversation about land use planning and what land use planning, what we want land use planning to look like, what we want it to achieve. One of the reasons I'm concerned about merely reforming zoning is a few things. First is the politics of NIMBYism are so robust at the local level. And then, of course, you have extreme municipal fragmentation at the local level. So in the bottom left here is a map of incorporated jurisdictions in Southern California. This is partly why we have to, at a minimum, pursue a statewide reform approach, because there's just so many municipalities. You just couldn't do a municipality by municipality reform effort. You would need some effort at the state level. But even at the state level, to a certain extent, you're playing a game of whack-a-mole with local governments that don't necessarily want to liberalize, as long as they have the power to determine who gets to live where. Exclusionary jurisdictions especially really cling to this power, and they will find ways to circumvent even the most robust rules. As long as they have the power to determine what use can be built where and at what density, they will use it toward exclusionary ends. On the right here, I highlight an image from a housing element. Essentially, these are the housing plans where the mechanism by which we do fair share housing allocations in California through a process called RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And so what we do in this process is we say to local governments, okay, you need to identify in your housing element where your affordable housing is going to go and how you're going to make it work. And this is very typical of what a lot of local governments do. They put the most housing in the worst possible area. So here they're saying, we're going to put high density multifamily housing, all of the housing that we're being mandated by the state to build, we're going to put it in the armpit of 2 freeways. Now, I'm not an environmental planner, but I would probably guess that this is the worst possible place to put housing, short of putting it right next to a slaughterhouse. But this is the type of behavior that we see over and over again in municipalities when they retain this wide latitude to determine every single detail of what gets to be built where. And this is even in a state that's very progressive and very proactively trying to think through these problems. You know, I earned my graduate degree at Rutgers in New Jersey, another state that has a framework like this, Mount Laurel. And even with robust state involvement, because zoning just gives so much power to local governments, it ends up being used in these exclusionary segregationist ways, even when you have robust state oversight. So, you know, what would it look like to move to, I think, a new zoning framework? I think there's two pieces to this story here. There's the real world examples that I think are interesting, and then I think some big picture conversations that we need to have next. So I think one of the interesting elements here is I talk a lot about Houston, and Houston is fascinating, not necessarily as an all-purpose model for planning, far from it. I think, you know, Houston made just about every other planning mistake that most other peer cities of their generation made. You know, they did the urban freeways. They were too callous on environmental planning and protecting sensitive natural areas. They engaged in other bad policies. But as I argue in the book, I think one of the big planning mistakes of the 20th century that Houston did not make was they did not adopt this zoning system that comprehensively segregated uses and restricted densities. And partly as a result, you know, Houston is able to grow and adapt to a degree that very few cities in the US are able to. Of course, Houston over the last 20 years has undergone explosive population growth, explosive economic growth, and yet it remains one of the most affordable and diverse cities in the country. You know, sometimes I give this talk to audiences and they're a little skeptical. You know, what do we have to learn from Houston? What, you know, they've made all these planning mistakes. It's this totally car-oriented city. And on the one hand, I hear that. You know, I'm all in on some of the other commitments that planners have, and I think that we need to have better planning and on many margins in Houston. But bigger picture, working class families are moving from places like Los Angeles and Boston and New York to places like Houston. And they're doing that because those are the only, Houston and similarly liberal land use environments are the only places where we're actually building affordable housing at scale. But Houston's lack of zoning, I think, actually makes it easier to solve a lot of the planning challenges that Houston and many other cities are dealing with. So in Houston, for example, it's very easy to take that single family home and turn it into 3 or 4 townhouses that are just going to allow more people to live closer to job centers, closer into the city, have shorter commutes, and then once the infrastructure is there, take transit or ride a bicycle. It's very easy in Houston to take those dilapidated strip malls or 50% vacant office parks and turn them into mixed-use 5-over-1s with apartments above shops. In any other city, of course, these are huge fights. These are generation-long reform efforts, and in Houston, they're just happening. And as I teased previously, having this housing abundance and having this broader land use regulatory flexibility makes it easier to solve some of the other planning challenges that cities are dealing with. So, of course, Houston has almost completely eliminated veteran homelessness, and they're on track to completely eliminate street homelessness. Why? Because they're operating in context of housing abundance. It's very easy to put a family, as soon as they lose access to housing, it's very easy to immediately put them into a new unit, right? In Houston, for example, it's perfectly legal to build single room occupancies, essentially where you rent a bedroom and you share a bathroom and potentially kitchen facilities. Historically, that was the housing safety net, but zoning in many cities made that illegal to build and then amortized it to where it had to essentially shut down where it did exist. In Houston, you can still build them. And you know, I think it's an important case study for folks who are thinking about what does land use planning look like beyond zoning, warts and all. But you know, I think there's a very superficial reading of my book that is purely critical of planning or purely critical of the project of land use planning. I actually think one of the biggest costs of zoning is that it's actually distracted us from doing what we really want land use planning and what we really want planners to be doing. So you know, I think there are real concerns that people have with incompatible neighbors. I think there really are important considerations that have to go with managing infrastructure commensurate to growth. And I think you know, less true in from what I've seen in the Mid-Atlantic, but certainly in many parts of the country, we sort of let a lot of that classic physical planning and infrastructure planning fall to the wayside in this focus on administering zoning. We have so many planners who have incredible capacity and an incredible passion for building great communities who are wasted counting the number of parking spaces in a strip mall or wasted processing rezoning to legalize a business that already exists, or are wasted fighting with neighbors to allow a duplex in a cul-de-sac in context where the median home price is over $1 million. I don't think that's actually the best use of our planning capacity. I sketch out, I think, a few details of what I think a post-zoning land use framework would look like. I think first is we need to get better about regulating the impacts that people really care about. When I was a planner, and I encountered this with many planners, people do have serious concerns about things like noise or things like light pollution. To varying degrees, some cities regulate this really well with a lot of detail and robust enforcement. Many cities don't. Many cities will have one or two lines about the issue of noise, which is arguably one of the largest quality of life issues in many cities, excuse me. Or I think related to that, in terms of the impacts of new development, parking or traffic congestion. We very superficially regulate things like this. In many cases, there's no on-street parking pricing. I am a Donald Shoup acolyte, so of course I have to do a plug for a little bit of parking reform and the idea of parking benefits districts. Of course, we'll need a really robust role for planners to play in building equitable, integrated communities. Of course, housing abundance gets you a lot of the way to solving the housing affordability crisis, but there are always going to be some populations that aren't served by the market, who don't earn enough or are on a fixed income or have unique special issues. And of course, you're going to need to have robust efforts by planners to ensure that those people are appropriately housed, and then also to provide incentives to rebuild the integrated communities that we really want and that are necessary to build a cohesive and thriving city. I think the bigger picture too here is revitalizing this tradition of planners as stewards of the public realm. I think is very important. I'll talk to local policymakers in so many suburban or exurban contexts where they have the most incredibly complex zoning code you've ever seen, detailing the minor details of facade materials and setbacks and pitch of the roof. And then they won't have a streets plan, or they won't have a parks plan. They won't have a bigger picture plan for what growth is actually going to look like in the meaningful sense. I think so much of our current land use planning framework is focused on micromanaging what happens on private lots, and we've actually let the public realm go to waste. And I think this is not entirely true. There's some contexts where I think this work is underway and it's really exciting. So I highlight the city of Bastrop here, which did a complete overhaul of their planning institutions amid explosive growth. This was an outer suburb of Austin, so of course they're under a ton of growth pressure. And they've completely rebuilt their planning institutions to essentially allow for a lot of flexibility on what you can do on private land. You can have fourplexes, you can have zero parking, you can have certain community neighborhood commercial uses. The code's pretty agnostic about that stuff that normally eats up land use planning efforts. But then there's a clear plan for, okay, we're going to have a streets grid. We're going to direct growth away from some of our environmentally sensitive areas. We're going to have regular plans. Here's our plan to build out public services commensurate to growth. This is, I think, your experience may vary, but when I say to people at a party or at a family gathering, I'm a planner, this is the type of work that they think we do. And it's a little bit of a letdown when I say, well, I'm mainly processing rezoning applications. This is the type of work that people value, that makes our cities better, that makes our cities affordable and resilient and sustainable and integrated. And this is the type of important work that planners did historically. And I think this is part and parcel of a land use framework going forward. But as I said earlier in this talk, we're in a really exciting moment right now where I think people are thinking really big about what we want to get out of our cities and how we're going to plan those cities. And so I think the bigger picture argument in the book is I'm inviting planners to think big. These are conversations that, of course, we've had internally, and they're coming out into the broader world. And I think planners really can lead on this issue. What do we want land use planning to do? What does it look like to build the next great American city? So I look forward to the conversation, and thanks so much to everyone for tuning in.
Great, thanks, Nolan. And thanks to everybody who sent in questions. As usual, we've been inundated by them. So we'll chat here with Nolan for at least the next 45 minutes, getting to as many of them as we can. And we'll have Nolan turn on his camera so you can see him while we do the Q&A. Excellent. Okay, well, we're going to probably jump around a little bit topic-wise based on what you were speaking of throughout the presentation, but we'll just soldier on and get to as many as we can. So the first one here is from Adani Sanchez, who says, What are some of your tips to talk to folks without an opinion on zoning? And what's the elevator pitch to eliminate or at least rethink zoning? I'm thinking about how to talk to my new city council members.
That's a really great question. So the way I generally approach it is I will find a great pre-zoning neighborhood in a city where I'm talking to policymakers and try to take them for a walk or show them neighborhoods are fantastic. But then you can point out, hey, it's actually illegal to build new streets like this. It's illegal to build new neighborhoods like this under our current land use codes. It's illegal to make some of our existing neighborhoods more like this neighborhood. And I think people start to get it. You can hear the gears turning when you provide real concrete examples of what this looks like. I find that whenever I talk in terms of floor area ratios or setbacks or parking ratios, that doesn't make any sense to people. And to the extent that they're coming up with their own idea of what I'm proposing, they start to think, oh, you're trying to turn this neighborhood into Manhattan or Hong Kong. If you have a real world tangible example of great development or great communities, great neighborhoods within your community, I find that that's highly effective. Especially on the East Coast, in many cases, there are great low-rise multifamily housing typologies, or there are great little corner groceries that, to the extent that they've survived zoning, people cherish and they love. And you can point to those types of developments and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if our community had more development like that? Wouldn't it be great if we allowed for more of this?
Thanks, Nolan. Next question here is from Marion Gale, who asks, when we are talking about eliminating zoning to make a more livable and just city, is this largely about zoning for types of residential or employment use rather than zoning for broader land uses such as industrial, light industrial, et cetera, to avoid negative externalities or incompatible adjacencies?
Yeah, great question. So, this ties back into Houston, right? And so cities, as I mentioned, cities even before zoning would specify that certain uses that we know are going to be offensive do need to be in a separate part of the city. And even in unzoned Houston, of course, there are rules that are similar. So any sort of oil refinery activity or any sort of sexually related businesses, essentially there are rules saying this can't be within so many feet of a residence. I tend to think that's a better way to deal with this problem than to say we're going to assign every single land use to a specific parcel. And I think that's what the question was getting at, which is, I think that's exactly the right approach to it, is to say there are certain truly offensive uses that we know need to be in a certain, we know need to be kept separate from a certain sensitive uses like residences or schools or religious establishments. But the way we solve this problem by having comprehensive land use segregation, I think, is the wrong approach. I would say focus on those uses that you know are most offensive. That's how we solved this problem historically, and it generally worked. And then focus on the impacts too, for everything in between, right? So, something I find is, yes, everyone likes the corner grocer, everyone likes the corner barbershop, but they're terrified that that's going to become a bar at some point in the future. We can solve that problem the way we solve it today, which is we write out, comically large lists of every single permitted type of business in every given zoning district. And then, of course, these things quickly fall out of date very quickly. Just a side note, I was doing research on home-based business regulation, and so many ordinances would say they would have a list of explicitly permitted home-based businesses, and it would be stuff like clock repair or like cobblers or millinery. And you're like, when was this zoning ordinance written? Of course, it was in many cases written 70, 80 years ago. Rather than doing that type of strange work of trying to come up with where every single use is appropriate, take the most offensive uses, put them in their own place, and then have clear impact rules. Say, okay, this is corner commercial, but we're going to have very strict and clear rules on the amount of noise that can be generated, the amount of parking, the amount of traffic that can be generated, and we're going to have strong enforcement of that. I think if you actually have clear and robust enforcement of the impacts of new development, I think a lot of the impetus to engage in a lot of zoning behavior goes away.
Great, thanks, Nolan. Next one here is actually a comment from Lee Crone, who says, I suggest that characterizing certain zoning rules as bad is not necessarily useful nor helpful. I can understand how rules may be counterproductive toward goals sought to be achieved, But I also question whether swinging our pendulums from one extreme to the other is useful. Yes, current parking requirements may be overwrought, but I wonder whether simply eliminating minimum requirements across the board ignores the practical realities of automobile use and travel.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree. I think there are some rules that are unambiguously bad. I think it's okay to say that. I think it actually strengthens our case for other rules. I think I do find that certain planners feel the need to defend institutions that were inherited that I think have been transparently dysfunctional. Take the case of parking requirements, right? Eliminating parking requirements doesn't mean that no new parking is going to get built. In almost every context where we've removed minimum parking requirements, typically developers, at least for the near term, go on building 80% of the parking that was required, if not building all of the parking that was required. In downtown Los Angeles, when we removed the parking requirements, developers didn't just stop caring about parking, partly because they wouldn't be able to sell the condo or rent the apartment or rent the office space that didn't have parking. And then, of course, they wouldn't be able to get a loan from a bank to do that. But they became more creative about sharing parking or having offsite parking. Or renting out parking in existing public garages that were empty. So, I think there are certain rules where we can just say, this hasn't worked, it hasn't achieved what we wanted, and it's actually counterproductive to some of our planning efforts. I mean, this is a broader element of this that I think is funny and in a certain sense, is that you read comprehensive plans all over the country. You read these beautiful comprehensive plans, and they talk about how we want to build an affordable, integrated, sustainable city, and it's going to be this wonderful thing. And then you open the zoning ordinance, and there are rules that are antagonistic to almost every single component of that. There are rules that institutionalize segregation, that make it hard to build affordable housing, that make it illegal to build neighborhoods that aren't completely built around the car. And I think it's okay to say, hey, there are some rules that are in tension with our broader planning objectives, and it's okay to scrap some of those and focus more on the rules that actually get us the type of cities that we want.
Thanks, Nolan. Next question here, I think gets to a little bit what you were just saying a bit earlier, and that is, would you agree that one of the biggest problems of zoning is the community's reluctance to revise its regulations? The zoning regulations that you point out were good planning practices at the time, but the problem is that most communities are not willing to embrace change or support the evolution of their jurisdiction to accommodate new land use concepts. So how would you suggest planners address the inertia that normally exists with jurisdictions and with elected officials?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's another thing that's gone wrong with zoning, is that these codes get adopted and then it's extremely hard to change them. Right. So of course, New York City is still operating on a zoning code that was essentially written in 1960. I would contend that New York City has changed a little bit over the last, 80 years now, 60 years now, excuse me. So this is, of course, a huge problem. I mean, I think there are a whole bunch of ways that state governments try to solve this problem. For example, requiring comprehensive plans, requiring that those comprehensive plans be updated regularly, and then requiring strict consistency between the comprehensive plan and the zoning document. In places where that's been robustly adopted and enforced, I actually think it's working quite well. DC, of course, has their future land use map, and then zoning, of course, is fairly strictly held to that, which I think is effective. That's one way to overcome that issue. I think, but it's tough, right? It's tough unless you have those legal mechanisms that are to a certain extent binding of local governments. It's hard to overcome, I think, that opposition. And that's what we see in the case of Austin, where Austin, for the past 10 years, Austin knows that their zoning code is completely inappropriate for the local context of the city. And they've been desperate to try to change and update their zoning code for the past 10 years. And it's looking like the thing could completely fail, right? Because there just wasn't the legal framework in place. And so they're stuck with the zoning code that essentially keeps the city in a straitjacket. I think this gets back to the root, though, I think, of why I think we need to move past zoning as a land use planning framework altogether, is that even in the best of cases, I think as the questioner, I think, astutely pointed out, even in the best of cases, a well-written zoning code only reflects the conditions of a particular time and place. But as the questioner points out, these codes in many cases remain in effect for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. I've seen zoning codes that were adopted in the 1920s and haven't meaningfully changed sense. That's putting your cities in a straitjacket, and that makes it very hard to solve a whole bunch of other planning problems. That makes it very hard to allow for the city to grow and adapt as conditions change. That makes it very hard to pursue other planning objectives that might be in tension with some of those inherited assumptions.
Thanks, Nolan. I guess another few questions around this line. This one's from Ray Tomalti, who asks, impact or performance-based zoning makes perfect sense in theory, but have they worked in practice anywhere? It's very difficult to police the amount of traffic or parking needs that a land use generates after the fact.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think so noise, I think actually we can be quite a bit more effective at regulating things like noise or light. I think part of the reason why we got the zoning institutions that we have today is historically it was very hard to measure and regulate and price these impacts. Right, so it was very hard to measure noise in scientific terms in 1920, or to measure a light, or there wasn't a framework for thinking about how to manage parking or traffic. I would contend that I don't think there are a lot of technological solutions in this space, and I think most people suggesting otherwise are probably trying to sell you something. But this is a space where I actually do think we can get more technologically sophisticated at dealing with some of these problems, right? So of course, in the case of noise, right, in France, they're piloting automatic sensors that would essentially be like red light ticket cameras, but for vehicle noise. That might not be the appropriate way to deal with noise associated with a business, but essentially we're getting better at measuring some of these things, and we're getting better at automatically enforcing some of these mechanisms that would deal with some of people's concerns about mixtures of uses without necessarily, again, putting cities in a straitjacket. With parking, I think, to plug parking benefits districts again, if you're having issues with spillover parking, the effective way to deal with that problem is not to mandate that a whole bunch of parking has to be built on the property itself, regardless of the actual needs and demands of the people who consume that space. The solution is to manage the commons, to have a parking benefits district, to apply pricing for on-street parking. That's politically difficult. I think there are ways to overcome that, including earmarking some of that funding that's generated for improvements in that existing community, repaving sidewalks, planting street trees, or dealing with problems of congestion. Certainly in cases where you have limited access roads, the way you deal with congestion is pricing. And you take the revenue generated and you put it into alternatives to driving. I don't want to be too callous. I mean, I think the questioner is exactly right that these are tough things to do in practice. This is going to require entirely new capacity for some local governments. You're going to have to make sure that the enforcement happens in an equitable way. In a fair way. That's of course really important. Those are all issues that of course were once issues for zoning as well. But that doesn't mean that I think we shouldn't try to move to a system where we actually regulate the things that people care about, and then free up our cities to be able to change and adapt in a deeper way.
Thanks, Nolan. We'll keep on this track here with a question from Gilles Marin, who asks, we have 49 zoning districts, which is I think too many. Could reducing the number of districts and adding to uses address the issues created by the strict segregation of uses? Yeah, so as I highlighted, it's a great question. As I highlighted with the case of Japan, I think part of what works in Japan is that there are a limited number of zoning districts and they're broadly pretty flexible. So you still have some relative certainty about what's going to go in near you, but you can still allow cities and neighborhoods to diversify, to get denser, to grow and adapt over time. I think one reform we're never going to have a system like that at the national or the federal level, nor do I think we probably should. But you could have frameworks like that at the state level, where the state government says, okay, within the state of, let's say, Maryland, here are going to be the 15 zoning districts that local governments can map. They reflect a broad range of the planning context in Maryland, but generally there's going to be a relatively consistent set of rules that apply based on to these districts, regardless of where local governments map them. I tend to think that that's a framework that's probably underappreciated. It works quite well in countries like France and Japan. It gets you a high degree of consistency and certainty. It allows for that small developer who works in one suburb to go and work over in the next suburb without having to hire a lawyer and a planner.
You know, of course, the status quo works pretty well for folks who want to do this type of work, but it makes it very difficult, especially for small developers. So having fewer, more consistent zoning districts, I think, actually does get you a lot of the way to some of the reforms that need to happen.
Great, thanks, Nolan. Next question here is from Sky Tallman, who asks, can you imagine getting rid of use tables and replacing them with nuisance or impact tables?
I can, and yeah, I actually think that's the direction we need to be moving in. I think that's, you know, these are the things that people really care about, right? When they're deciding whether or not to move into a neighborhood, they're concerned about these types of impacts, and we talk about uses as a proxy for these impacts. And I think, you know, I give an example in the book, right, of a somewhat infamous example. That this might actually be familiar to some of the DC area Maryland planners. But the issue of a cell phone store. So of course in DC, they had the Metro PCS that was blasting music out all day, every day. I know there's a complicated politics of gentrification there that I don't want to get into. But the zoning districts essentially just said, yeah, okay, like this is a certain type of commercial district, and this is cell phone stores are allowed because cell phone stores only make a certain amount of noise, right? Well, then of course you have extreme variation. The AT&T store, the Verizon store is not blasting out music all day, every day, like the Metro PCS store. We use these, or same with bars, right? You know, so if you travel around the Northeast and in the Midwest, many neighborhoods have bars historically that are in existing residential neighborhoods, and they're good neighbors, and they keep the music down. And if the smokers are out front making a bunch of noise at 2 a.m., a bouncer comes out and shoos them away, and we're able to solve the problem, and we're able to have uses in our existing neighborhood. And especially with bars, I would contend that that's a positive thing, because rather than the status quo where we take the bar and we put it in a commercial district that's far away from where everybody lives, and then we require that bar bizarrely provide a whole bunch of off-street parking, we put the bar in people's existing neighborhood, and then we just hold that bar to very high impact standards. I think if we move closer to this framework, I think then the resistance to new infill development, or the resistance to mixed-use neighborhoods, slowly starts to fade away. And you know, I tell all this story not just to set out a vision for, I think, where we need to go, but to clarify, I'm sympathetic. I think, you know, there were reasons why some of these rules were adopted. I don't think that was the best way to solve these issues, and we could do much better. But I don't think we should be callous. And my argument is very much not an argument for just getting rid of a whole chunk of planning and doing nothing. I think my argument is very much for let's think about what we really care about in land use. Let's think about what we really care about in land use compatibility, and focus very specifically on that, and use this amazing planning civil service that we have in this country, regulating the things that people actually care about and building the cities we actually want.
Okay, thanks, Nolan. Next question here is from Kathleen King, who asks, what do we do when the market doesn't match up with desired uses? For example, most people in the community want more small local retail on ground floors, but there's only so much retail space that the market can support. So ground floors are either vacant or turned into offices.
It's a good question. It's complicated. You know, as I argue in the book, I think zoning abolition or a reform is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And I think you do need other programs in place to support local businesses. You know, I can show you thousands of main streets all across the country that have fairly strict zoning, where most of the properties are sitting vacant. And in many cases, the zoning is actually standing in the way of revitalizing those main streets. So, you know, I was traveling around Eastern Kentucky not too long ago, and I was in a small town that had, of course, a main street that was 50% vacant. There's a lot going on there, not to suggest that it's just zoning by any means of the imagination. But I look at the zoning code, and of course, it's illegal to use any of those commercial properties without essentially demolishing this historic Main Street building and building a giant parking lot. You know, so or we make it very hard to build those types of small commercial spaces as accessory commercial units, maybe additions to people's homes where they could be small storefronts, where we make it very hard to build these types of small commercial spaces that might be inherently cheap. You know, I was just reading, there was a great a book that just came out on Tokyo. I don't want to distract you. Everybody needs to go buy my book first. But when you're done with that, there's another great book I think it's called Emergent City, Emergent Metropolis, looking at Tokyo. And one of the interesting findings that they success is that they point to the way that Tokyo has this incredibly healthy, thriving ecosystem of small businesses. And their hypothesis for why you have so many of these little small businesses and small commercial spaces is that that's the ground floor of someone's single family home. So somebody lives on the second floor and they're not a big commercial landlord. They're not, renting out to the tenant who's going to pay the highest rent. They're not, aggressively courting large chains. Those small commercial landlords who maybe just have an additional commercial space attached to their home, an accessory commercial unit, as we like to call it, that person will rent out to the small local business. That person will rent out to the small, unique, esoteric business. Maybe the type of thing that doesn't make the most financial sense for them as a commercial landlord, but it's the type of thing that them as a resident of the community wants to have in their community. So having more small spaces, having more flexibility, getting rid of, I think, a lot of these bizarre use rules that apply to main streets, right? So again, this same town, I was kind of curious, like, what are some emerging commercial uses? One emerging commercial use that I see in many small towns is board game shops, selling board games, hosting nights where people can come play board games. These are some of the most active third spaces that are being built in many U.S. cities. And of course, in that Main Street context and so many other Main Street contexts, it wasn't listed as a permitted use. It wasn't clear if it was even legal to open it or not. And frankly, if a local was going to open something like that, the easiest path for them would probably be to do it out in a new greenfield development in a strip mall. So I think, of course, necessary but not sufficient. I think we do need to make sure that we don't have some of these zoning rules that stand in the way of small businesses revitalizing some of these small, unusual commercial spaces that we have now that are standing in the way of new, small, unusual commercial spaces being built. But that's not going to get you everything you want. You're going to need to have programs that make it very easy for small businesses to operate. You're going to want to have a tax treatment that works for small businesses. You're going to want to have new business incubators. You're going to have to be doing a host of other things to get the type of small business ecosystem that you want. But as I argue in the book, I think use rules that make it very hard to open a business in many parts of U.S. cities, or that set really strict rules on how those businesses can and can't operate, regardless of their actual impacts, I think hurts all of that.
Okay, thank you. Next one here is from Will Mackaman, who asks, with Minneapolis's single-family zoning elimination, are you aware of any data or evidence that supports that decision, or is it too early to tell?
Yeah, so this is a kind of an interesting story here. So Minneapolis made history as being one of the first cities to eliminate single-family zoning after having adopted it. It hasn't yielded a lot of units, actually. I think this is one of the unfortunate parts of the story. There hasn't actually been a lot of that duplex, triplex, fourplex development as a result of that. There are a few things going on there. The first is, I think, exactly to the questioner's point, there just hasn't been a lot of time. It takes time for the market to respond to zoning changes. And so that's part of what's going on. Part of what's going on, though, also is they changed the use rules, but they didn't actually change the massing in the floor, in the permitted amount of floor area. So essentially what they were saying was you can take existing homes and they can be duplexes and fourplexes, and there's inherent value in that. But if you don't allow for additional floor area, or if you don't allow for a slightly larger envelope, then of course you're not going to get a lot of that infill development. I will say about the Minneapolis plan, where they did see a lot of units get built, is where they did the corridor upzonings, where they liberalized zoning along the corridors to say, we're going to allow for more mixed-use multifamily along the corridors. That is immediately resulting in new housing production over the last 2 or 3 years. And Minneapolis has seen a real boom in housing permitting. Not incidentally, Minneapolis is one of the only major cities in the U.S. where housing prices have been flat in real terms. You have all this new supply coming online that's mediated out home prices. So, I think the takeaway from the Minneapolis case is there's really not a silver bullet here. There's no one element of the zoning code that you tinker with and you're going to get housing abundance and equity and sustainability. It's an iterative process. Even here in California, where we've legalized accessory dwelling units, we legalize accessory dwelling units in the broad picture. So the first attempt to get cities to legalize accessory dwelling units in California was in 1982. That was the first time that the state of California said to local governments, you need to legalize accessory dwelling units, and if you're not going to do that, you have to write this book report. Naturally, very, very, very few jurisdictions went along with it. In 2016, of course, almost 26 years later, 36 years later, this thing gets teeth. But then even over the course of the past 5 years, there's been a lot of cleanup legislation, a lot of closing loopholes, a lot of ironing out some of the language. So these things take time. You have to iterate over them. But yes, you can't just say we're going to eliminate single-family zoning and that solves everything. You have to be doing other policies that stand in the way of the type of infill that we want.
Thanks, Nolan. And thanks everybody again for submitting all these questions. We'll just keep plowing through them. The next one here is from Heather Saylor, who asks, where is the helpful research regarding the success of removing parking and to help show the community the harm of single-family zoning? We are rewriting our zoning code and people are concerned with more density and allowing commercial, for example, corner stores in single-family residential areas, but surprisingly, the removal of parking has only received pushback about impacting those with disabilities.
Yeah, great question. The simple answer is that if you send me an email, I'd be happy to send you some resources on it. My email is nolan@caemb.org. The longer answer, so we're right now, one of our priority pieces of legislation in California is AB 2097, which would exempt, in broad brushstrokes, would exempt developments within a certain distance of transit from parking requirements. And we've faced all different kinds of pushback. I think the first thing, I said this earlier, eliminating minimum parking requirements doesn't mean eliminating parking. And it's funny because I think that the urbanists don't particularly like this, but this is just the reality of it. And I think this deals with some of the criticism of it. If a developer and if the person underwriting that project thinks that they're not going to be able to sell or lease the space without so much parking, the parking will get built if it's physically feasible. And this is what we see, in many contexts, as they said in Los Angeles, the parking still gets built, but it might get built in a more creative way. It might involve shared parking, it might involve off-site parking, but the parking does get built. I would say, other than that, I think two things. First is we have this notion that off-street parking is free, and it's not. Off-street parking, of course, has to be paid for in the case of housing by future home buyers, by future residents who might not even own a car, who might want to live car-free. But if they have to buy that parking space, then they will buy a car. This is one of a very robust finding from transportation planning literature is if you have an off-street parking space at your home, even if you move into that unit without a car, you're far more likely to buy a car. And then what you're doing is you're just generating traffic and you're lowering the quality of life for everyone. Whereas if you don't have a parking space, you're far less likely to buy a car. People, nobody likes having a car, but then having to circle the block looking for a parking space. So, there's a real trade-off here. You can mandate the parking, but then you're just going to get a lot more traffic. The third thing I'll say about this is where we really need to manage the on-street comments to give people certainty to say, yeah, okay, we are going to have on-street parking permits. It might be based on lot frontage. It might be based on a per unit basis. The correct way to do this, of course, varies. But you can have some mechanism where we say, yeah, like the parking is no longer going to be a commons. You're going to have guaranteed parking, but you'll pay a small fee that goes into a pot of money that's used for community improvements, but you will have guaranteed parking. I think there's a whole bunch of different ways to slice it, and it's a complicated issue, and it varies quite a lot based on local conditions. But if we can be helpful, we're in the thick of thinking about parking requirements here in California, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, and we just put your contact information back up on the screen. So we've gotten actually several questions from folks asking what your views are about, and just generally about form-based code and how that fits in.
Yeah, so I think certainly in theory, form-based code is getting closer to regulating the things that people care about. I think to the extent that the form-based coders are pointing out that regulating the uses of what happens within a building or just regulating the floor area really isn't the thing that people care about. It really isn't the appropriate thing to be focusing all of our land use planning energy on. I think that's totally right. I think in some contexts, it might be appropriate to have certain workable design rules that make a building look a certain way, and if that can ease opposition to new development, I think that's positive. I think one of my concerns with form-based codes is, this is not with the theory, but as administered, in many cases these end up being essentially an overlay district on top of an existing zoning code. So what you end up with is a code that retains those rules that form-based coders hate, like use segregation and parking requirements and floor area ratios, and then on top of that just applies a bunch of design rules. I think that's, that's not really solving the problem. That's putting lipstick on a pig. So, it's not a black and white question. It really is, how you administer it, which is honestly kind of true of a lot of issues in this policy space.
Thank you. Next question here is from Rebecca Roberts, who asks, your analysis has focused a lot on zoning issues in large and mid-sized cities. Have you thought about zoning in rural communities or small hamlet and village type communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I gave a talk in Sioux Falls, South Dakota last week, actually, and I got a lot of questions about rural zoning. I think in rural context, the real planning challenge has to do with infrastructure, has to do with when you're going to put in wet infrastructure, when you're going to put in water and sewer, how you're going to finance that. I think there are complicated questions to do with managing growth commensurate to that. For example, in a context where you don't have water and sewer, it might actually be appropriate from a health and safety perspective to have a minimum lot size of a half acre, of an acre. I've seen various different estimates of what this would be. So, I think the considerations there are different. The health and safety considerations are very different. Rural contexts are also interesting because I think, certainly those of us who grew up in cities or suburbs have this bucolic notion of agriculture. And of course, in reality, agriculture is can be smelly, can be messy, can be loud. And I think people move to rural contexts and don't fully appreciate that. So, even if you just take a pure regulating impacts frame, of course, there's a lot of complicated considerations to be made of, protecting incumbents, protecting newcomers. I think, rural contexts are really where I actually think this transition to a more fuller picture of land use planning would be most valuable. I don't think you solve most rural problems by just coming up with a zoning district and saying we're going to just segregate uses and broadly restrict densities. I think the real planning challenges in rural contexts are going to be your infrastructure. They're going to be having a prudent way to balance different priorities with impacts. But I say all this with the caveat that I was a city planner in Queens, which is not exactly the rural countryside. So I think these are complicated issues.
Thanks, Nolan. Next question here is Adrian Akalian, or Arakalian, and I think she's from Los Angeles County. And her question is, how do we deal with NIMBYism when trying to reform zoning allowances and the political power they have? We deal with mostly elderly suburbanites who want to maintain the status quo. We like to blame the state for our necessary reforms, but we need to go even farther than state requirements. Unfortunately, our political representatives are often aligned with the NIMBYs.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, this is something I've been struck by. You look at some of the data from the 2020 census, and there are actually a lot of jurisdictions in Metro Los Angeles that are actually losing population. And it's not because there's any economic decline happening or anything like that. It's purely because no new housing is being built. The existing housing stock is inhabited by empty nesters, and family sizes are slowly shrinking. And so you have a lot of communities that are actually in population decline, that are actually shrinking. In many cases, places where actually it would be most ideal to build additional housing. This is a really complicated question, and this is, I think, partly why you need a lot of state involvement. But as you say, state involvement can probably only do so much in the near term. One way that I've found is really effective. I think the short version of this is that people actually really care about where their kids are going to live, and people care about where they might live in the future. The longer version of this answer is, in one sense, right, like the status quo in California works fabulously well for that retired couple that owns their own home, right? They probably bought their Southern California bungalow for 2 magic beans in 1970, and now it's worth $2 million. So in one sense, right, they've won the lottery. But in another sense, their children cannot live within 2 or 3 hours of them. They can't afford to buy a home anywhere near them. So they're never going to see their kids, and they're never going to get to see their grandkids when grandkids come into the picture. All of their friends and colleagues are cashing out. And because when you sell your home in California, in most cases, you can't afford to buy another home in California. You have to move away. So their community is essentially moving away. And yeah, they still have single family zoning, but homes are slowly being flipped. These old bungalows are slowly being flipped into modernist McMansions. Right? So in a certain sense, this household won the lottery, but in a deeper sense, the community is literally collapsing. Communities are falling apart. Families are being torn apart. Friends are moving away. Those seniors, in many cases, don't have anywhere to retire within their existing community. I mean, this is something I find in exclusionary suburbs the world over is you have folks who are retiring, certainly of older generations, and they want to downsize. Maybe they want to live in an apartment or a townhouse where they don't have to do lawn maintenance, they don't have to do property maintenance, and they're finding there's literally none of that in the current community. They cannot downsize. They don't have a housing stock that allows for folks who are living at every stage of their life. So I think this is where it really hits people. Maybe I'm just a little bit too cynical, but I really think that when you frame housing in terms of this is the type of housing your kid might live in, or this is the type of housing that you might live in someday, then I think people become a little bit more open to it. They become a little bit more understanding of why we need this type of housing. But I'd be curious to hear what other solutions folks have come up with.
Okay, we'll monitor the comments if folks add things in response to that. But meanwhile, I'll go on to the next question. And here it is. It's costly financially and with time to overhaul the zoning code entirely. And many of the rural communities in my MPO region are hesitant to make changes to their zoning code. However, they are also tired of variance requests. So where's the middle ground? Granting a variance could be beneficial if the zoning ordinance wasn't written very well in the first place, but it also could be troublesome down the road since it's not implementing the future land use identified in a community's comprehensive plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think because zoning has become so restrictive and so out of sync with the reality of the way that cities need to grow, or even suburbs and rural areas, cities essentially get addicted to these discretionary relief mechanisms that were always meant to be the exception, right? Variances were meant to be this thing that were reserved for exceptional or highly unusual cases. And now in most contexts, you can't build almost anything without having some type of discretionary relief, be that a variance or a special permit or a rezoning. I was just reading about Dallas, where even Dallas relatively liberal land use environment. Of course, they still have zoning, but essentially every single development of any scale has to be a planned unit development. So like I really frame it as an addiction, right? Like cities do this as an exception, and then of course it just becomes normal process, and then before you know it, almost your entire local planning capacity is being used processing variances and planned unit developments and rezonings for projects that not a lot of people would find issues with. So that is tough. I think this is where state and federal government could play a helpful role here, providing grant programs for local governments that want to engage in liberalizing reform to do that. I think when I'm talking to local policymakers too about the approach to reform, I think I have that grocery list of reform ideas that I think make sense in almost every U.S. context. Get rid of your single-family zoning. Get rid of your parking requirements. Lower your minimum lot sizes. Refocus on impacts, etc. But another way to think about how to approach zoning reform is to say, what are we getting variances for? Where are we getting rezonings? That's your market signal that the zoning is binding and that reform might be appropriate in that context. I think it would be great if there was more state funding, state and federal funding for local governments that wanted to engage in that type of desperately needed liberalizing reform to do that. Because I agree, in many cases, especially in rural contexts, the jurisdiction might not even have a full-time planner. All the work might be contracted out. And they might have very little excess fiscal capacity to rewrite these broken rules that were adopted generations ago. So I think, it would be, I think there is, of course, something to be said for local governments just coming up with the money and doing this type of work. It's going to make administration of local government easier in the long term, but it would be nice to have more state and federal funding kicked in to help with that process.
Thanks, Nolan. I know we're going to go over a little bit if you have time, just given the volume of questions, maybe we'll go another 10 minutes or so, if that's okay.
Let's do it.
Excellent. Okay, next question here is from Jack Wisner, who says, I note that your book title prompts a question. I wonder about arbitrary. Are not most lines intentional? That was the assertion in the book, The Color of Law.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've been asked that before. I think the decision to include arbitrary, I think, is that in many cases, these codes or these rules have been presented as if they are the result of intense scientific scrutiny, as if they represent revealed truths about the universe. I think a lot of the sort of standards that we work with have this very technocratic gloss, floor area ratio being a great one, or parking ratios. Part of what I wanted to do with that is stress that these rules are social. These rules are inherited. These rules in many cases were sort of random guesses with parking requirements, right? If you look at the ITE parking generation manual, in many cases they're making recommendations for parking requirements that are based on like 5 observations and have an R square that would not get you published in a journal. So that's where I think the focus on arbitrary is. I think, but the totally fair question, and I think that to the extent that these rules weren't purely arbitrary, and to the extent that they were intentional, in many cases they were pursuing planning objectives that we wouldn't find legitimate today, such as institutionalizing segregation or trying to nudge everyone into a car. So the arbitrary is just meant to stress that these are human institutions. These are institutions that in many cases were adopted with very little study or very little research, and that we can and should be having big picture conversations about how to change them and what the system looks like going forward.
Great, thank you. Here's one from Kirk Westfall, who asks, do you think accrediting organizations like the APA should take a stand that single-family zoning is unethical to perpetuate and instruct people who have AICPs to dismantle it?
Yeah, well, great question. I think planners are in a tough situation, right? I think some planners are working in a context where if they broach these topics, their employment might be in jeopardy. Some planners are in contexts where they're actually being requested by elected officials to draft some of these reforms and dealing with folks in the civil service who may be a little bit more conservative. And then I think the most planners are working in a context where there probably isn't a lot of strong feelings about this stuff one way or another, and entrepreneurial planners within the civil service could push for these ideas. I'm AICP. I think I'm lapsed on some of my credits. Don't rat me out. So I took the oath and completed the exam, and I know that we as planners, of course, have an ethical obligation not to participate in planning policies that leave people without homes, that produce segregated communities, that put our communities in a situation where they're going to be in danger of climate change going forward. So I do think planners already under the current framework have AICP planners have an ethical obligation to be pushing for some of these reforms and to be champions for reforms that live up to the oaths that we've taken. Of course, you have to balance that against respecting democratic institutions and working around political considerations. I will say I've been really encouraged. I think APA National is increasingly leading on this issue. I think there's an awareness that planners have an important role to play in the reform efforts that are underway. I think after some difficult conversations, California APA has come around and supported a lot of reform efforts that we're working on, and that's really fantastic. I talked to so many planners who are grateful that planning institutions are finally having these conversations. Planners who worked in contexts where they would say, I knew that our zoning code was entrenching segregation. I knew that our zoning code made walkable communities illegal, but I didn't have the cover to say it. I couldn't be able to point to leadership from the American Planning Association to say, hey, these are the reforms that we need to be undertaking. So I think that we as planners, and to the extent that we're organized, need to be a part of this conversation, need to be pushing some of these reform ideas, need to have a seat at the table. I think historically there was a defensive-ness of some of these institutions, or a reluctance of folks not in the family talking about some of these issues. That line's been crossed, right? People are talking about zoning, they're thinking about zoning reform, they're thinking about what we want out of land use planning, they're thinking about transportation planning, and I actually think that's fantastic. That's a fantastic opportunity for planners to once again be at the forefront of rethinking how we plan cities in a way that really hasn't happened in many generations of planning. We're operating under planning institutions that we inherited from a very different time, and I think historically the typical reaction among planners was to just be defensive of that and to try to preserve that at all costs. I think there's a more viable long-term way of thinking about it as planners, saying let's be proactive, let's be part of the reform energy that's happening right now. Let's rethink that next great land use planning system. rather than have it just be imposed on us by reformers from the outside.
Okay, thanks, Nolan. Next question here is from David Takahashi, who asks, can you speak to zoning reform aspects that are key to mitigating climate change?
Great question. So I would say a few things. First is today we probably make it hardest to build developments in low VMT areas where people are most likely to be able to walk or ride a bike or take transit. And we make it easiest to build on the ex-urban periphery where car dependence is almost guaranteed. I would say we should flip the script on that, and we should make it very easy to engage in the type of infill development that many current zoning codes stand in the way from. And you can reduce vehicle miles traveled, which of course is increasingly the major source of greenhouse gas emissions in North America. I would say another piece of this too, there's a great book, Green Metropolis, essentially pulling some of the data showing that multifamily, folks living in cities is actually one of the best things that we can do for the environment. So when folks live in maybe an apartment building where they can walk to their daily needs or take a train to their job, to the extent that anyone's going to continue to be working in offices in the near future, they dramatically decrease their greenhouse gas emissions. Not only that, but they dramatically increase almost every environmental indicator that we care about. Folks living in cities produce less trash, consume less water, almost every margin we care about. Now, I'm not saying that everyone has to live that way. I'm not saying that it's the job of planners to force everyone to live that way. But if you just look at prices, it's actually clear that there's enormous demand among many families and households to live that type of lifestyle. And because we make it so hard to do, we make it very expensive. Very few people are able to. So I would just say, increasing the options, allowing more cities to have those types of urban neighborhoods that are currently illegal. Give folks the options to live that way if they want to, and if they choose to live that way, they're going to dramatically decrease their impact on the environment.
Okay, thank you. Here's one from Grant Beck, who asks, have you ever looked at zoning for manufactured housing in your research? And do you have any opinions on adapting or revising zoning laws to include manufactured homes or other factory constructed homes?
Thanks for the question. So that does actually come up in the book where I'm talking about the ways that zoning often prohibits the most affordable type of housing. So in cities, that's SROs, which I've already talked about, but in many suburban and rural areas, zoning will often outright prohibit manufactured housing. Now, it depends on the state. For example, in New Jersey, there was a state court precedent that said that local governments could not discriminate based on manufactured housing, but that's the exception. In most contexts, local governments can and do discriminate against manufactured housing that might otherwise follow all of the zoning rules that are in effect. So, I think we need to remove a lot of that discriminatory language that's in zoning codes. I find that in many municipalities, to the extent that they allow new mobile home communities at all, they're often only allowed in industrial areas or commercial areas. Essentially, we're putting the most affordable, relatively dense housing in the worst possible area that we could put it. I think that's inappropriate. I think we should allow these types of developments anywhere that we've deemed, at a minimum, and anywhere that we've deemed are appropriate for residential development. Of course, this is another one of these issues where zoning reform is necessary but not sufficient. You're also going to need certain changes to federal regulation that in many cases make it difficult to build and sell manufactured housing. Of course, you need building codes that achieve health and safety objectives that are really important, but without needlessly discriminating against manufactured housing. So there's a lot going on there. But yes, I would say, in answer to the questioner's concern, at a minimum, we should remove a lot of this discriminatory language against manufactured housing from zoning codes.
Thanks, Nolan. Next one here is from Joel Mills, who asks, Code Next is a great example of a public process that fails to educate and inform citizens on public choices and feeds conflict that leads to polarization and eventually complete paralysis by local government. Does your book address needed reforms to public participation work in zoning?
That's a really important element of it. I don't touch on it too directly. I worked with Barbara Fega at Rutgers, and she was an expert on public process, and I learned a lot from her. I would say in terms of the mechanics of actually administering public process, I think that's not my area of expertise. I tend to think we need to have more of a range of options. I think the traditional public hearing doesn't get us the type of public input that we want. In many cases, the people who are coming to the traditional public hearing are not representative of the broader community. There's a great book on this called Neighborhood Defenders, essentially showing that these people are disproportionately very wealthy, tend to be older, tend to be white, in contexts where that might not be representative of the broader community. So you need public input mechanisms beyond just that classic public hearing. You need focus groups, you need design charrettes, you need scientific surveys, you need meetings with stakeholders. You have to have a range of options. You can't just have that public hearing before you're about to adopt something. I would also say not only just the form of public process, but when you do public process. I think most public process, code next notwithstanding, most public process related to zoning happens in a very reactive way. Developer proposes to build something, and then we have a giant public hearing where everyone gets to yell at him or her, and then the planner just sits there quietly, and we learn very little. And if the elected officials are scared, the project dies. I think that's really I think it's the worst possible way to do public process. And the best possible time and place to do public process is when we're writing that comprehensive plan, inviting people not only to just come, show up, and say no, but inviting them to come and tell us what would you say yes to? What do you want your community to look like in the next 10 or 20 years? I think, I think comprehensive planning work is really important. And to the extent that zoning has sort of overwhelmed local planning efforts and really sidelined the important work of comprehensive planning, I think that's made planning worse. And the great thing about the comprehensive plan is that when it's not this reactive process where you have timelines and risk of litigation and all of this other stuff. I mean, there's risk of litigation with everything in planning, but hardly to the extent with an individual rezoning. To the extent that you have more time to be deliberative and to talk to a broad cross-section of the community, I think that's the appropriate time and place to be doing a lot of public processes, when you're writing a comprehensive plan. But then when you've written that comprehensive plan, when you have projects that comply with that vision, there shouldn't be a whole bunch of added additional case-by-case reactive public hearings where the only thing that people can essentially say is no. I think we need to give people more opportunities to say yes and set the parameters and say, this is what kind of community that we want to live in. These are the broad rules that we want to have in effect. But if projects come in that follow those rules, they're going to get their permits without much fuss. I think that would be a huge improvement over the system that we have today. I mean, this is the great thing about zoning reform broadly, maybe to just put a bow on some of the points that we've talked about. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit for reform here, and there's a lot of appetite for reform. And so, I think finding the avenues that will work in your local context, finding the reforms that are politically palatable, finding the rules that might be binding in your particular context. Minimum lot sizes might be important in one place, but not in another. Same with parking requirements, same with single-family zoning. The solutions here are going to vary. And so part of the way I've written the book is to try to keep it open-ended. I think to let planners and activists and advocates and elected officials find local solutions that work.
Great, thanks, Nolan. We'll just ask you a couple more and then we'll close here. So then this next one's from Kimberly Pontius, who asks, how will autonomous vehicles and even autonomous aerial vehicles, probably coming within the next 20 to 50 years, going to change all these zoning rules? And should we be crafting plans now for these emerging technologies?
Yeah, so to my mind, the potentially transformative transportation technology from a planning perspective that's just around the corner is electric micromobility. If you've ever been on an e-bike or an e-scooter, you immediately get it. This is clearly the appropriate way to be navigating a dense urban environment through individual transportation. I have many friends who now commute via electric micromobility. If you actually look at the numbers of sales, electric micromobility sales are just outpacing electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, I think, are mainly like continuing on the same track that we're on with cars. They could go either way. It could reduce traffic, it could increase traffic. I've seen scenarios that suggest either way. Could lead to more car ownership, could lead to less. I would say that the things that we need to do now are the things that we need to do regardless of whether or not we're going to have mass automated vehicle, electric vehicle adoption. Of course, you need to be thoughtful about having charging stations for folks who might be living in multifamily buildings without parking. But I think the real technological change that's going to be transformative for mobility in the nearer term is going to be that electric micromobility. You're going to have more people on bikes, more people on scooters, and you need infrastructure to be ready for that. But I'm to a certain extent stop talking outside my issue of expertise. I'm principally a land use planner, and I'm sure some transportation planners have clever thoughts on this.
Thanks, Nolan. And yes, we've covered this in a couple other webinars that we've done that focused more in that area. So here's one from Timothy Barzek, who asks, I'm a federal environmental professional and hear a lot about trying to use permitting to address industrial pollution next to vulnerable communities. But these situations often arose from historical zoning laws. You eventually get into a lot of finger pointing about who's accountable. What would be the baby steps toward reconciling this given the historical inertia keeping them in place?
Very complicated question here. So, right, I think exactly to the questioner's point, I detail this in the book. The way that zoning has historically solved issues of incompatible neighbors is not necessarily to engage in the kind of comprehensive rational planning that we aspire toward, but to put the most offensive uses in areas where people were politically weakest. And so, of course, as I highlighted in that case with the multifamily building going next to the freeway, we put, in many cases, we put the most housing, we put the most affordable housing in areas with extreme environmental justice concerns. I would say one thing we can do in the near term is not replicate those zoning patterns and take away the power of local governments to engage in that type of exclusionary land use planning. In contexts where it already exists, it's very complicated. I think there's really probably no way around having regulations that try to internalize those externalities, to have scrubbers, to have soundproofing, to have technologies to deal with emissions. You're going to have to find ways to internalize that. Sometimes that might require, sometimes that's already feasible and the offending use just isn't doing it. And because we just didn't have the regulation to force them to do it, they haven't done it. And when we do, they'll get it done. In some cases, it might require subsidies, might require actually putting up money to resolve some of these issues. It's complicated. It's going to be case by case. I would say that one of the bare minimum that we can do, though, in the near term is to stop engaging in these practices of zoning that gets you significant environmental justice issues.
Thanks, Nolan. We also got a question about asking what your lapel pin is today.
Oh, yeah. So that is a Philadelphia row house. It's from a nice series of pins celebrating different missing middle housing typologies all over the country. Gotcha.
Okay, I'll just end with this comment here, which just came in, and give you a chance to respond to it. So is your view basically just do what Oregon does or has been doing for the past 5 decades? Talking zoning reform without mentioning Oregon is like talking baseball history without mentioning the New York Yankees.
I think Oregon has done a lot of things well that we have to learn from. Larger state involvement in local land use planning efforts, a land use planning framework that makes it very easy to build the type of walkable mixed use infill. And they've done, I think, a really exceptional job. I don't think any particular state or city has the trick to solving these issues, and I think local solutions are going to vary quite a lot. I actually think this is a point that I make in the book. Something that's very strange about zoning is the extent to which it's so similar all across the country. The U.S. varies dramatically from Baltimore to Miami to Detroit to Nashville to Los Angeles to Seattle. These are all dramatically different planning contexts, and it's very strange that we ended up with a system that looks so consistent all across the country. The right land use planning framework actually probably varies quite a lot from state to state and from city to city. And so I totally agree. I think there are lessons to be learned, a lot of lessons to be learned from not only the land use planning efforts that have been undertaken in Oregon, but the environmental planning and the transportation planning. I think I would argue, to promote some of the work we're doing at California YIMBY, I would argue there are lessons to be learned from some of the preemption efforts happening in California. There are lessons to be learned from cities all across the country that are liberalizing their zoning codes. But the path is going to be different for every city. There are certain things that we know need to happen, but how we get to the other side, how we get to a place where we can actually once again build cities that are affordable, equitable, accessible, and sustainable is going to look slightly different everywhere. And so, I think this is a project where again, just to reiterate, I think there's a superficial reading of the book that's just criticizing an existing area of policy. But what I'm trying to do in the book is invite planners to undertake this next great challenge in planning and thinking through, the current system we have hasn't worked, but guess what? We have a lot of really smart, passionate people working on this issue, and we can build a better system, and we can build a system that builds the type of cities that we want. And that's what I'm inviting people to do with Arbitrary Lines.
Great, thanks, Nolan. And thanks for spending so much time answering all these questions. We still have 600 people with us from our group. But, and as always, we never get to all the questions, but we'll share every one of them with you directly. And we've had your contact information there as well. We just wanted to give you a chance to kind of give us some closing thoughts and takeaways today.
Yeah, well, I think on top of some of the points that I've just made, I would also add a word of caution. I think moments come and go. Moments for reform come and go. Where I think we have a special moment now where we have a window to undertake reform, where there's an appetite for reform, where local elected officials in many parts of the country are thinking about this issue for the first time. And I think it's important to strike while the iron's hot, to strike while people are thinking about these issues. We might not have the same type of reform energy that we have today 5 years from now. And it's really important that we seize these opportunities to build a planning system than the one we have today. If I didn't get to your question, of course, I'm on Twitter, so you can hop over there or send me an email. We're, of course, at California EMB, we're thinking about statewide reform efforts, and we're always just thrilled to hear what's going on in other states, or what we can learn from what other states are doing, or if there's anything that we can help with other states. So we're happy to chat, and let's stay in touch. I think, like I say, this is the moment. This is an exciting moment for folks who work on land use planning. And I'm really excited to see some of the work that's happening all over the country.
Great. Thank you very much for being with us today, Nolan. And with that, we're going to conclude our webinar, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Nolan Gray for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars. We have many coming up, including Rural Renaissance, Revitalizing America's Hometowns Through Clean Power, which will be next Tuesday, September 20th. Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future with the American Farmland Trust on Thursday, September 29th. Our annual Walktober Walk-in-Our series with the Maryland Department of Transportation on Thursday mornings in October. And finally, a new one will be coming out soon, The Park Maker and the Form Giver, How Frederick Law Olmsted and Henry Hobson Richardson Reinvented America's Public Spaces, which will be on Tuesday, October 11th. With that, I wish everyone a great day, and thanks for being with us today.